I never met a single person in my life, like never met a single person who uses Docker and is not vulnerable to Docker privilege escalation. Yeah. So today we will see if you are part of a Docker group, if you type groups, and if you're part of Docker group, then you are straight up, I would say, vulnerable to Docker privilege escalation. Somebody, anybody with just one command can get root access on your system. But before we move forward, we want to make an assumption. We already have initial foothold on the target, which is Ubuntu user. That's why there's a, okay, that's why you are on privilege escalation. Otherwise, you are on exploitation phase. And second assumption, you don't know the password of the Ubuntu user, because if you knew the password, he can just do sudo bash. There's no need of Docker. So what you see is you found a user who is using Docker and is part of Docker groups. What he can do, he can just do priv-esc. So it's very simple. Docker run tag rm tag it, and you can mount volumes, your host file system, okay, your host file system inside Docker container under mnt folder /mnt. I will use Alpine image. Then you can type sh if you want to, but I don't need to. Now, who am I inside Docker container? I'm a root user. Let's go inside mnt folder. I have mounted entire entire file system of host system inside my Docker container, which means I can go inside home, but I'm interested into root user. Why not? And flag.txt. Then, yeah, you have entire access. You cannot just do that. You can come back. You can you can actually change etc shadow file. Yeah, you can create or add a new user. So you don't need to worry about any of that. So you don't have to always mount. If you are using something, you can establish a persistence by creating a new admin user. It's easy, you don't need to worry about it, but just how it works. Okay, now one thing to keep in mind when you are mounting volumes and using Docker, don't use an image which runs as non-root user inside Docker container. So as we saw here, I'm a root user. By the way, # means root user. So I'm a root user. If I was somebody else, it could have been difficult for me to access these file systems. So what do I mean by that? First thing, this only happens in few scenarios. Like why you want to use Abhishek, I could just pull the Alpine image. It's really small image. It only happens when you don't have internet on the target system. Okay, we play serious and we see that a lot. Or and he also does not have any image which runs as a root by default. So that is one thing. So to showcase a demo of it, I have an image here. So I will run again same command, docker run tag rm. I want to remove the container once I'm done. Interactive mode. Then I will mount my again host file system inside Docker container. Very obvious. And this time I will use pi. What is happening? Okay, it should be volume, and I'm using pi. Now by default, pi uses as non-root user. So if I do who am I, I'm a non-root user, my user, and I'm using #. I'm using $. $sign means non-root user, # means root user. So let's try to go under mnt and root. Permission denied. I cannot do that because if I go under mnt, ls -la, these all files are owned by root. And now I cannot do that. And being Alpine so stripped image, I cannot use sudo su or sudo because Alpine does not come with it. Must be suid to work properly. Okay, so the solution of it is really easy. It also depends upon how the image is using users, or how the users are configured inside the Docker image. So what you can do is you can specify Docker user when you are running Docker command as root. And now again, who am I? I'm root user, and I go on inside root, and I can access info.txt. It's my host system. So that is one thing. It's not always going to work, but most of the time it works. You can pass any user. You cannot just pass any user. You can also specify user which has what do I say? Let's try again. Okay, let's do one thing. Can I cat pass wd? Yeah. So there are multiple guests, multiple accounts. These are service accounts. They should not be used as a session. You cannot get shell on it. But if you are using Docker CLI, you can. Let's try nobody user. So I will exit out of it. Though it doesn't give you any special permission, but just to showcase nobody. So if any user is part of this @3 password, that means the user exists, even though he is not allowed to log in, not allowed to get bash shell or any interactive shell. And now if I do who am I, I'm nobody user. In best cases, you will always go with root user because even nobody user cannot access this file system. Just to show you mnt and root. No, he cannot do that. Only root user can do that. Now you may be thinking, Abhishek, if that's the case, first of all, if somebody is part of Docker group, you can get priv-esc very easy. You can mount entire file system inside Docker container, and from that you can access sensitive files, you can modify files, you can create new user by modifying @3 shadow and @3 password. And if a image or a container runs by default as non-root user, you can use tag u and then root to get a root shell or try to get root shell. Then the question you might ask yourself, what's the solution? Like, how can you avoid it? And I would say the solution of these kind of tricks are pretty misleading, and we will see the solution. Some of them are wrong and some of them are understood wrong. Okay, so let's try. What is what is user namespaces? That's the solution, by the way, to avoid what these mounting issues that we are doing here. Okay, you cannot just mount any user. So let's see what is namespaces are. So first of all, Docker has a concept of remapping. Okay, user namespace remapping or user namespace remapping. What it does, first of all, let's understand what are namespaces. Linux namespaces provide isolation for running processes, limiting their access to the system resources without running process being aware of limitations. Okay, Docker is just a fancy wrapper around namespaces and C groups, which is a part of Linux kernel. So what it's trying to say is namespaces kind of separates, okay, creates a barrier between your container and your host system. Good. Let's move forward and let's see the best way to prevent privilege escalation attack from within a container. From within a container is to configure your container's application to run as unprivileged user. For containers whose process must run as root user within the container, you can remap this user to less privileged user on Docker host. The remapped user is assigned a range UID which function within the namespace as normal UID but have no privileges on host machine. So what does this mean? The Docker definition of you that you can create a new user, okay, in different namespace. In different namespace, it will work as a root user, but on your host system, it won't hold any significant power. It will be a less privileged user. Like even root user will be a less privileged user in your namespace. So we will create a different namespace and let's see how we do it. This is the documentation, you should read it. But today we'll gonna do something copy paste. I prefer mdcat. So let's create a group Docker remap. Just copy paste. And for now I'm entering password. Okay, it's just to showcase, okay, how you can protect against these kind of mounting issues. Then we are creating again a user, and we don't want it to get any shell or anything like that. Then we are getting warning that you are outside this boundary. We will fix it. Copy this line, paste it. We are saying the user or group should have UID and GUID between these integers. What they mean, simply put, they will gonna have least privileges, but you can read the documentation. Again, we are not here for that. And then we have to make this configuration change under Docker daemon by default. Okay, user ns means user namespace remap. Then start the systemd and start the Docker, restart the Docker. Cool. Now let's try the same trick again. Docker run tag it tag rm. I want to delete container. I don't want any clutter in my system. Then I will mount in volume slash under mnt and alpine image. What happened? Alpine Docker images. That is weird. Did I just remove? Okay. Now we need to pull the image again. And because, okay, I will tell you again later. Let's just pull the image. It shouldn't take too much time. It's a really small image. Please do it. Yeah, it's working. And now we have the image. And who am I? I'm a root user. So I mounted my host file system inside mnt. So let's try /mnt ls -la. This file system is now owned by nobody. So I cannot go inside root. I cannot. I don't have permission anymore because I'm not the part. The root user think he is the root user. He should have been able to get to the root user, but in a different namespace, like a different box. He does not hold any permission on our host file system, on our host system. So it's not even kind of a root user. It's a root user for its container, but not for the resources on the host system. So let's exit out of it. And now you may be thinking, Abhishek, is it the solution? Like it just worked. Now the person cannot read anything. No. So the problem is this trick is made to protect somebody from container escape. So what do I mean by that? Your Docker container is running MySQL server. If you a vulnerable MySQL server, and that person get access to the MySQL server, exploits it. Now he is inside Docker container. From inside Docker container, he cannot read or have access to the host system. That doesn't mean somebody who has access to the host system cannot specify different namespace. So I can just do user ns and host. And now I can just go /mnt /root and I get the flag.txt. Yep. This Docker command has more privileges than your container inside your container. You can overwrite by default user namespace. Before, when we did this configuration, we said by default you will gonna use Docker Remap as a user on your host system, but nobody is stopping us to specify or override user system as host. So if attacker gets initial access to your Ubuntu account, it doesn't matter that you use this remapping or create a new user inside image. He can modify or override all these configuration at runtime. So that is one thing. Now, and what else that I could tell you? Yeah, one thing. If you are thinking that can we specify a root user like -u, can I do that? You can do that. And if I go inside mnt and /root, still you cannot do that. Why? Because this root user is on different namespace which we created here. Okay, we didn't create it here. It's just a remap. So in reality, when you are executing root on your host system, it is a Docker remap, which is a very least privileged account. He cannot access your file system, things like that. Kind of complicated. Okay, but think the moral of the story is it protects you from inside Docker container to escape Docker container. It does not protect you if you are running a command from host system. So if you have control over Docker command, these protections does not work. That's the thing. Now, what's the solution, Abhishek? Like what else we could do? The solution, the simplest solution, okay, things get complicated. The simplest solution that I can give you, don't add users to the Docker group. Okay. Now, if our attacker get access to the Ubuntu user, he needs sudo password to execute Docker. In this case, he does not have password. Let me exit out of it. Let me share again. Okay, so in attacker does not have Ubuntu password. He cannot execute. Running Docker with sudo is equal to adding user to the Docker's group. The only difference is when you a user, Ubuntu user, part of Docker group, he does not need any kind of password. With sudo, he needs sudo password. So he gotta ask to the Ubuntu user. So just don't add any user to Docker group. But it has a problem. When we talk about organizations, like imagine you are the administrator and you have a DevOps engineer. His role is to manage Kubernetes clusters or Docker containers, things like that. He will have your sudo password. Okay, so now you can either add him to the Docker group, which I again don't recommend. You should give him sudo privileges instead. And Abhishek, if I give him my DevOps engineer sudo privileges, then he can just do sudo bash. No, you can specify in your sudo's file that I just want him to execute sudo docker. We see that a lot of time. Okay, like sudo l. I don't want to do it. Just imagine I don't have password. So you can say the DevOps engineer can only execute Docker command with sudo. But again, the problem is you indirectly giving admin access and giving admin access to the root user. So here's the thing. If you are a home user, sudo password is unknown to the hacker. The hacker does not know the sudo password. That's why he cannot execute Docker and cannot priv-esc. But if you are in the organization, you have a DevOps engineer, you add DevOps engineer to the sudo group, that means sudo password is known to the DevOps engineer. Now, if DevOps engineer knows about these privilege vectors, privilege escalation vectors, he can use his password to get root privileges on your system, even though he's not part of Docker's group. So it gets a little complicated. When you're a single user, it does not really matter. Like but in your organization it gets a little complicated. Then you go under Seccomps and you limit system calls, you perform some sort of authentication, things like that. So there's no easy way to avoid it. That's what I'm trying to say. Now let's come over here. There's a guide ebook. It's by Hackersploit. It's a really good ebook. I'm not saying that it covers a lot of things, but it covers a lot of things. And when I say Docker security, I always say it, Docker security starts from host security. So first protect your host, then comes to the Docker security. And second thing, a quiz for you. Like this trick is available on GT4bits. If you don't know GT4bits, guys, you are not playing CTF, play CTFs. Why we are doing chroot/mnt? We didn't do it. Why GT4bits is suggesting that? Go ahead, find out. And again, as you can see, if you can run Docker with sudo, still you will have root access. And suid bit is again, yes, suid bit. And if you're part of Docker group, you can still have root access. So that is the whole thing. It is really difficult for you to avoid a Docker group. It is really difficult to avoid Docker privilege escalations if you are part of Docker group. So the moral of the story is, if you are a single user, don't add your Docker, any user to the Docker group. Then the person who gonna do priv-esc needs your password. And if he has your password, then he can just do sudo bash. If you are an organization, then you need to take more measures, and that we will talk in different videos. I will probably create 3 or 4 more videos about Docker. I want to make it as a series or something. In the next video, we'll talk about Docker, Dockerd, Containerd, shim, and runrc. What the heck this thing is, how this thing works. And one thing, the limitation of what we just discussed here, Docker remap. So one limitation of Docker remap is that if you create Docker remap, you cannot even mount normal file system. So mounting, volume mounting is very common thing under Docker. But if you create this thing, you have to make your file system world readable. So what do I mean by that is, like, you're creating Docker run tag rm tag it slash volumes under mnt and alpine image. So who am I? And I can go inside Docker and root. So I don't have this permission. Why? Because I cannot mount any file system from my host inside mnt. That means if you legitimately needs a file system from the host, a path, you cannot do that. For that, you gotta give that file, that particular directory, world read write execute permissions. Again, not a good idea, but That's a limitation that you gotta endure if you are doing this kind of things. So that's all. We will cover more of it again in next videos. I hope you liked it, and if you didn't like it, I don't really care. Yeah, I shouldn't have said it. uh yeah, I know. There were a lot of hopes. Video is ended, by the way. You can skip or cut. I'm just thinking, did I forgot something? I don't think so. I didn't forget anything. Now you know how to priv-esc. It's simple. And why the Docker remapping actually does not work if you have access to the host system and Docker CLI, it's just not gonna protect you. This was designed to protect from sandbox escape or Docker escape. So somebody hacks inside your Docker container, he cannot have privileges on your host system. So that's all. I hope you liked it. Okay, I was just joking. And if you liked it, there's nothing you can do. Bye.